Welcome to CivilNet. My guest is Cheryl Thomas. She's the founding director of Global Rights for Women. Since 1993, Cheryl has been working with partners around the world to promote women's rights and achieve effective systemic and legal reform to end violence against women's rights. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. I'm so honored to be here.
We are too. So you worked closely with the United Nations to develop model standards for violence against women. And for violence against women laws, you co-chaired the United Nations expert group meeting to draft the UN handbook for legislation on violence against women. That was back in 2008. So where are we now in terms of women's rights and violence against women and fight for violence against women?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. You know, there's been so much progress since 2008. I would say there have been many laws passed around the world. Armenia is a good example, passed their first domestic violence law in 2017. And other countries have done similar work on laws and policies and practices with both the legal system and communities. And it's been actually heartening for me to see the progress that's been made since 2008 and all of the organizations and governments that are using these United Nations resources to review their own laws and amend them or pass them in the first place. We also have a long way to go. Both things are true. There is still just a devastating crisis of violence against women and girls throughout our world. It is a global phenomena. It is not unique to any country. They are everywhere it's been studied. We know that women are suffering just such brutality, particularly in the forms of domestic violence and sexual violence. Those are the most common forms of violence against women and girls that we know in the world.
And do you feel like since some decisions were made from governments, there were in the whole system some step forwards or backwards, or do you feel like there were some steps backwards from governments related to the issue of women's rights?
Of course, yes, absolutely. It's so interesting to see how progress goes forward, and then maybe the government that's made a lot of progress goes backward. I think of my own country. The United States was a clear leader in legal system reform on violence against women in the late 1970s and early 80s. We passed the first, for example, specific order for protection laws to serve domestic violence victims back then, and one of the first shelters in the world in Minnesota, in fact, where I'm from. But then also we see, this past year where women's freedoms, reproductive freedoms have been taken away from them. I was just in the United States, and I was just listening to a report last night about how this is such a risk, not only to women's equality and integrity and independence, but to their health and their lives. I was listening to a report about a young woman in Texas who was not able to get medical care when she needed it, and she almost died because she needed an abortion, and the doctors were too afraid to deliver that care to her. So huge step backward.
Mm-hmm. So according to the UN's global database on violence against women, that's the best annual reports we have about the situation for women. In Armenia, lifetime physical and or sexual intimate partner violence was 8.2%, and physical or sexual intimate partner violence in the last 12 months was 3.5%. Now, if we compare, for example, with France, it seems that it's way less than what is happening in a developed country such as France, because we have some data about this. The lifetime physical and or sexual intimate partner violence was 26% in France compared to Armenia, where it was 8.2%, and physical and or sexual intimate partner violence in the last 12 months was 5%, while in Armenia it was 3.5%. However, these data are not entirely reflecting the reality for Armenia.
That's absolutely true.
Could you tell us why this is not reflecting this reality?
assumption is, and I've seen this in my work around the world, is that when a community really commits itself to ending domestic violence, and by that I'm really talking about intimate partner violence, that's the most common and dangerous form of domestic violence. When they commit themselves, when the community, the government, the legal system commits and takes really concrete steps like strong laws, building shelters, building hotlines, what you will see is that women will report a rape. They will report intimate partner violence. If those community resources aren't there, remedies in the law, shelters, service centers, why would a woman report? It would only, in many cases, put her at more danger if there's not a service or a legal remedy to provide to her. Her husband or intimate partner in these cases might just really be empowered to continue and even worsen the violence as a retaliation for her reporting it. So women are not given unless they're given an incentive with good community responses, they're not going to report violence. They're going to try to take steps on their own to keep themselves and their children safe. And our statistics are not going to reflect the violence that she's experiencing.
So in this case, Armenia still needs, the government and the state in general needs to keep the women of Armenia safer or give them a safe place. Mm-hmm. That is still lacking here.
That's still lacking here. It's lacking in many countries around the world. Armenia is not alone. Many countries around the world do not have strong laws on domestic intimate partner violence or sexual violence. That's very common. Or if they do have laws, even strong laws, they're not enforced. So that remains a huge challenge for our world. A special rapporteur at the United Nations that's focus or job was to kind of survey country responses to violence against women. Once I remembered this quote very vividly. She was traveling around doing her research and investigation from country to country, and she said, impunity is the norm. There is very little accountability, globally speaking, for perpetrators of just really pervasive, brutal, continuing violence. And that, along with shelters and services that women need to go to immediately to protect themselves and their children, we can't build enough shelters for the level of violence there against women and girls there is in the world. We have to get at the root causes. We really have to address the accountability. We have to hold violent offenders accountable and communicate to them, to the victims themselves, the survivors, and our whole communities that sexual violence and intimate partner violence and domestic violence will not be tolerated, that there will be consequences for it.
So another issue in Armenia is sex-selective abortion. Mm-hmm. It's a very common thing that is still going on in Armenia. It's a very alarming problem, actually. And according to the UN Population Fund's Anti-Sex Discrimination Program, the issue of gender-based abortion remains very relevant in Armenia. Although we see some progress, for 2021, 108 boys were born for every 100 girls last year. So my question is, what responsibilities does the Armenian government have here, and what should we do to stop this mm-hmm. phenomenon?
Well, I understand that it is sex-selective abortions are not legal in Armenia, so that's important. I think that when that's happening, we need to, as communities and leaders and government officials, we need to reflect on why. Why is that happening? What is it about the lives of women and girls that make it so their parents, are not, it's not preferable to have a girl? That tells me that there's something very unequal going on in Armenia when parents aren't confident that a girl will live a full and equal life and be able to serve her community, be a productive member of the family, helping, you know, just have an income, be independent. So I would imagine that is what's behind that statistic.
So it's also about, I guess, breaking some of the stereotypical perception that we have about women and men in general in a traditional country.
Absolutely.
Such as Armenia.
Absolutely, that men are going to be more valuable. A baby boy is going to be more valuable to his family than a baby girl. That is a concrete piece of evidence of inequality.
So since women have been struggling for their rights, do you feel like the fights that women are taking part in now is different from the one that they were taking part in 20 years ago?
Absolutely.
In which way?
Yeah, it evolves. I see so much change, really all the time, every year. I would say that depending on, of course, the geopolitical situation of the country is always a factor. You know, for example, even the war in Ukraine, we see this incredible, just devastating increase in violence against women and girls in Ukraine. And that's very typical when a society breaks down, either because of a violent conflict like that, natural disasters. When the infrastructure breaks down, the vulnerable, including women and girls, become much more at risk of violence and abuse. So, you know, the overall, I would say, in comparison to 20 years ago, my experience has been that there's been more progress globally to promote the human rights of women and girls than backtracking. But there are powerful examples where that's not true, like Ukraine, like Ethiopia, like Haiti, like the United States, as I mentioned before.
And lately, governments designed or ratified acts in favor of women's rights, and some passed or will pass law to stop violence against women. But do you think we are on the right path to finally eradicate these issues related to women and domestic violence against them?
I do think we're moving forward. The progress is too slow. I'm grateful, for example, that Armenia passed its law in 2017, and now there's energy towards amending that law, for example, that makes it stronger, makes it more accessible to survivors of violence. So that's heartening to me. Those steps that you're taking here in Armenia, in your community here, I see as, yes, that's a good path. And the more awareness that grows about the impact of this violence, not only on women and girls, but the ripple effect it has on their families, on communities, on, you know, I think of Afghanistan. Just, you know, when you take the human rights of women and girls away, like they have done in Afghanistan, that is not only just demolishing for women and girls. The country is having a difficult time surviving in so many ways. You cannot erase half the population like that. So, you know, there's no one answer to your question. In some places we're on the right path. In other places, there's devastating throwback and continued oppression. Yeah.
And do you think that, and that's my last question, and do you think that one day we may be able to see a world where we reach finally this
I absolutely
dream
do.
of equality?
I absolutely do, or I wouldn't continue the work that I've done. I've been doing this work for 30 years, and what I see without question is that young women are demanding their rights, and that we are not going to go backward on that. Young women are going to continue to do that within their families and within their communities and with the government and the law.
Well, thank you, Cheryl Thomas, for this talk. Thank you for watching, and continue to follow CivilNet.